Today, we're going to tackle some really big and honestly often confusing ideas: sex, gender, and identity. These words get thrown around a lot, but what do they actually mean? Let's dive in and clear things up. So here's our game plan. First, we'll get right to the heart of the difference between sex and gender. Then, we'll get a little more personal and talk about your identity. After that, we'll explore how we even learn this stuff in the first place. And finally, we'll pull it all together to see why all of this is so important in our day-to-day lives. Okay, let's get right to it. First up, we're tackling the absolute foundation of this whole conversation, the core distinction between sex and gender. So let's just ask it straight up, because it's the question that causes so much confusion. Are sex and gender the same thing? You probably know the short answer is no, but the why behind it, well, that's what's really key. When you see them side by side like this, the difference becomes pretty clear, right? On one side, you've got sex, which is all about biology, our physical stuff. And on the other, you have gender, which is way more about social influences. You know, what society expects. Let's dig into each of these a bit more. So, when we're talking about sex, we're really talking about biology. Think chromosomes, anatomy, hormones, the physical characteristics that people typically use to define someone as male or female. In contrast, gender isn't about what's happening on a biological level. It's about what society says it means to be a boy, a girl, a man, or a woman. It's kind of like a cultural blueprint that can totally change depending on where you are and when you're living. All right, so we've got the basics of sex and gender down. Now, let's bring it inward and talk about how all this connects to our own personal experience. We're moving from these big outside categories to how we actually feel on the inside. And that brings us to this really important idea: gender identity. This is all about your own personal sense of self. It has nothing to do with what society says or even what your biology is. It's that deep down feeling of who you are, whether that's male, female, or maybe some combination of the two. Okay, so if we have this internal identity, how do we learn to show it to the world? Well, that's a process called gender typing. It's basically us picking up on all those traditional masculine and feminine roles. But how does that even happen? How do we learn this stuff? And that's the perfect lead-in to our next part. How do we actually learn about gender? We're going to look at the social machinery that teaches us all these rules. And it starts like super early. So there's a big idea that helps explain this, called the social learning theory. And honestly, the core of it is pretty straightforward. It basically says we learn about gender by watching people, imitating what they do, and then getting some kind of reaction for it. You know, either a good job or a don't do that. It really breaks down into 3 easy steps. First, there's observation. As kids, we're just sponges, right? We're watching everyone, our parents, our friends, even cartoons. Then comes imitation. We start copying the things we see. And finally, the big one, reinforcement. This is where we get praised or corrected, and that feedback loop teaches us what's right. So, what are we learning through all this watching and copying? We're learning something called gender roles. Think of them as the unwritten rulebook for how you're supposed to act based on your gender. It's the script society gives you. And let me tell you, these roles can have a huge impact. They tell us what's acceptable, but that also means they can be really, really limiting. I mean, think about it. How many times have you heard that certain jobs are for boys or for girls? For a long, long time, men were pushed away from things like nursing, and women were told they couldn't be engineers, all because of these invisible gender boxes. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, which brings us to the big question, probably the most important one. Why does any of this matter? Let's connect all these ideas and see the big picture. It's like building blocks, you know? You start with the biological fact of sex. Then, society layers on this whole idea of gender. We learn the rules of that gender through social learning. And all of that comes together to influence our own personal gender identity. This isn't just stuff for a textbook. It literally shapes our lives, from our jobs to our relationships to how we see ourselves. So, I want to leave you with a question. Now that you have these building blocks, sex, gender, identity, roles, start looking for them. How do you see them playing out in your everyday life, in the movies you watch, at your job? Once you start noticing, you can't unsee it. It's a whole new way of looking at the world. Thanks for hanging out with me today.